and maybe announcement of other events and so on if there are any.
Very end, I can do that. We only have one other event, but it's not yet on our website.
Yeah, kind of wait with not that I didn't want to do it, but it was sort of like I never had anything to compare that to. No, but it's sort of like you don't know the days ahead of time. Obviously, there's always that little bit of anxiety, blind spot, but it all went well. You know how it is.
Did they ask you questions that were all like
We should maybe.
I know they did. I mean, I think
Yeah.
Suzanne had a couple things that were kind of on the periphery of what I was doing, but there were a couple questions also in each one that were like right in my
Whenever you
wheelhouse.
are.
I
One was
already
for
see it
Islamic
on
history,
YouTube.
that was the one with Dr. Green, and then one was for religion in modern South Asia, and that was Dr. Long, and the last one was modern Indian Ocean. And, the Indian Ocean
That's right.
answered
It will be here and here.
material relating to the Hajj,
Yes.
and also the idea of the Indian Ocean as like a British lake in the 19th century. So it was all pretty close to what I had focused on anyway, which is nice. Sometimes they like specifically economic history can be kind of hard for me to sort through. So this is good. I liked it, and I'm happy to read some other books. Opportunities.
Yeah, from the church.
It's pretty good.
It's okay.
To the Indian Ocean?
South Antarctica.
Oh, no, I actually don't.
Okay.
I actually now down to
We make it more of a lake.
yeah, well, I think I want to say this.
Hi, hi, hi.
Are we allowed to sit?
Yeah, you can sit wherever you want.
You know when the program was? Thank you.
82, 83.
I'm gonna appear in the broadcast.
But you may not see the speakers,
Right.
only from there. I mean, I don't know. Maybe you want to watch.
Maybe another spot. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
You can take this as well. I'm gonna be.
No. Oh, that's right. It's fine.
Okay, hello, everyone. Why don't we begin? And welcome. Welcome to you all, those of you who are here in person and those who are on Zoom and YouTube. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian, and it is my privilege as the director of the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute to welcome you to a lecture entitled Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800.
Oh, wow, it's a smart screen.
And focuses on the disparate yet connected histories of Armenian printing establishments in early modern Europe and Asia. I am also pleased to be joined in our program by Dr. Taner Akçam, the director of our Armenian Genocide Research Program at the UCLA Promise Armenian Institute. And Dr. Akçam will be introducing our speaker in more detail very shortly. I am also pleased to note that this event is co-sponsored by the UCLA Richard Hovannisian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, the UCLA Narakatsi Chair in Armenian Studies, the UCLA Center for India and South Asia, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the Ararat Museum. We are grateful for the support of all of our co-sponsors. And on behalf of our co-sponsors here at UCLA, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tonga peoples. It is a privilege for our institution to acknowledge the history of the land on which we are established. Before we move on with our program and the introduction of our speaker, let me mention just a few procedural items. First, let me note that this event is being recorded for future viewing on our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute YouTube channel, and of course is visible now on YouTube. Second, for those of you in the audience, when the lecture is completed, please feel free to raise your hands and ask questions. For those of you who are watching via the Zoom webinar platform, if you have a question, we ask that you pose it in the Q&A window by clicking on the green button at the bottom of your screen and typing in the question. For everyone, please be sure that your question is clear and succinct. We will try to cover as many questions as possible today. And for those on Zoom, in the unlikely event that the Zoom webinar drops for any reason, please just connect right back to the same link, as it will put you back into our Zoom webinar. And now it gives me great pleasure to turn our event over to our inaugural director of the Armenian Genocide Research Program within the Promise Armenian Institute, Dr. Taner Akçam. As most of you are aware, Dr. Akçam came to us at UCLA relatively recently in the late spring, early summer of 2022, and has energetically initiated a series of important lectures, including this one. Dr. Akçam came to us from Clark University in Massachusetts, where for many years he was the Kalustyan and Mughar professor of modern Armenian history and genocide at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And as most of you know, he is widely acknowledged as one of the first scholars of Turkish descent to write extensively on the Ottoman Turkish genocide of Armenians in the early 20th century, and is one of the world's most prolific scholars currently pursuing research in this area. So Taner, I will now turn the event over to you for a more detailed introduction of Sebouh.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone, whoever you are in the world. Actually, Sebouh does not need any introduction. We all know him very well. However, it is a tradition to introduce the speakers. Let me do this with a couple of lines, and he was not generous. He sent me only 3 or 4 sentences of what I should tell about him. And Sebouh David Aslanian is professor of history and Richard Hovannisian Chair of Modern Armenian History at the Department of History at UCLA, and the inaugural director of the Armenian Studies Center at UCLA Promise Armenian Institute. Aslanian has published numerous research essays on early modern Armenian and global history in peer-reviewed journals, and is the author of the award-winning From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, the Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from New Julfa, Berkeley, US Press, 2011, and most recently of Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora. And he's going to talk about his recent book. But let me add something to this formal introduction. Those who receive emails from Sebouh would know a code that he uses under his emails. This is an amazing code, actually. In previous versions, he had a longer one, but he shortened now. I will read this short sentence to you because it captures really a lot of things. It says, the small nation is one whose very existence may be put in question at any moment. A small nation can disappear, and it knows it. This is the code. And you might think that this code applies to the Armenian nation, but listening to the Sebouh, I listened to him several times, and the last book talk also, we will realize that the opposite could be also true. This is the story of a small nation with its ability to survive, its superior skills, and its unending achievements throughout the history. I hope I interpreted it correctly, Sebouh, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'd like to start off first by thanking my friends and colleagues for making this talk possible. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Anne Karagosian, the director of the Institute. I'd like to thank the deputy director, Hasmi Bagdasaryan, and particularly as well, my colleague and friend, Taner Akçam. Last but not least, thank you all for being here today. I'd like to, before I begin my talk, I'd like to also take a minute to remember my predecessor who passed away this summer, Dr. Richard Hovannisian, who shall be missed and missed sorely in the coming years. So thank you all for being here. And on that note, I will begin. What I'm going to do today, as Taner and Anne pointed out, is to give a book talk of sorts on my latest book that just came out with Yale University Press called Early Modernity and Mobility, Court Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800. So let me begin first by reading a couple of pages from the conclusion of my talk. And I'm reading from my screen because my eyesight has deteriorated quite drastically. So, in his L'Origine de l'Imprimerie de Paris, published in Paris in 1694, André Chevillier, a librarian at the Sorbonne, recalls how an Orientalist colleague told him once that, quote, an Armenian had shown him in Paris a book he had brought back from Persia that he claimed que prétendoit those of his nation had printed in their language, unquote. The author's reluctance to believe that Armenians in 17th century Iran could have published a book in Armenian is a telltale reflection of a popular misperception, I should say, in early modern Europe regarding the craft of printing. Scholars of print culture, from Chevillier in the 17th century down to Lucien Febvre and Henri-Jean Martin in the 20th, and more recently Elizabeth Eisenstein and our very own Niall Green here at UCLA, have to some extent perpetuated this misconception by at one point or another, claiming or implying that the printing revolution initiated by Johann Gutenberg unfolded on a, quote, European or settler European stage. And this part is quite important. Chevillier once again reinforces the exclusively European nature of the printing revolution, which has been around with us for quite some time. And I quote here again from the same book by Chevillier, and he says, it is true that the printing press has left the bounds of Europe and has made itself visible in some cities of Asia and America. However, the people who have hosted it have not been other than Christian Europeans who live in those parts of the world and who have carried there the tools of printing through which they have placed in the hands of idolaters books of the Christian religion in the languages of those lands, unquote. In the same passage where Chevillier expresses doubts about the possibility that an Armenian book could have indeed been printed in Iran, he notes how the Carmelite missionaries had tried to import a printing press into Isfahan in the early years of the 17th century, but had failed to publish any books there due to the dry climate of the country. And I will be coming back to this point in a few slides from now. That indeed 3 separate Armenian-operated presses flourished in the Isfahani suburb of Julfa from 1636 to 1692, followed during the next century by several Armenian-operated presses in the Indian Ocean world, as well as in Ejmiatin in today's Armenia, would have certainly struck our Frenchmen as quite preposterous. So my book, Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities and Printers Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512 to 1800, provides a missing counterpoint to this largely Eurocentric retellings of book history, shaped by unexamined assumptions passed down from early writers like Chevillier to 20th century giants in the field of Histoire du Livre, the history of the book. So relying on the methodological insights of the Annales school, and I'll come back to this in a second as well, but globalizing its European or national unit of analysis. my book examines the rise of Armenian printing centers beginning in 1512 in Venice and continuing until the end of the 18th century, 1794-96 respectively, in places like Astrakhan, Madras, and Calcutta, across the mostly port city seascapes of the early modern Armenian diaspora. In all, Armenian-run printing establishments operated across 21 separate locations during the Gutenberg era of printing, the overwhelming majority of which were in port city locations where Armenian long-distance merchants specializing in luxury goods had set up tiny but affluent diasporic nodes. And of course, I refer to these Armenian merchants specializing in luxury commodities and so on as Port Armenians, a calque on Port Jew, which is a concept invented for Sephardic studies, which I find quite applicable, if not even more applicable, in the case of the Armenians that I study. And I hope that this will also become clear in the course of my lecture. So, yet the story of Armenian print culture told in my book does not focus solely on printing establishments by themselves. My aim is not to write yet another linear narrative of the history of Armenian printing establishments or printing presses and their operators as ends in themselves. Rather, I have sought to use an histoire du livre approach to explore Armenian print culture and the production of the Armenian printed codex in order to tell a much larger story that goes beyond the printing of books. I have utilized print culture as a lens through which to explore the making of the early modern Armenian diaspora, followed by the forced mobility and deportations that drove Armenians from their ancestral lands across the oceans, seas, and port cities of the burgeoning economy of what Chris Bailey once called archaic globalization. The story of the Armenian printing revolution told in my book was no doubt shaped by the port city structure of the early modern Armenian diaspora and came to be fashioned by its trans-regional networks of circulation and mobility. Both manuscripts and books circumnavigated this diaspora, as did merchants, priests, and sometimes, all too often perhaps even, printers or their printing instruments. My account of Armenian book history was in part inspired by reflections on books by the Trinidadian novelist and writer V.S. Naipaul. And I've read this passage several times in the past while giving book talks. And I hope that my sense of being enchanted by this beautiful passage does not wear itself off as a result. But Naipaul, whose ideas I don't share in general, his political ideas, is an incredibly gifted writer in the English language, and wrote this famous essay in the early 1980s for the New York Review of Books, where he discussed what he called the mundane side of things when it came to printing and when it came to books. And in that essay, Naipaul says, writing is a private act, but the published book, when it starts to live, speaks of the cooperation of a particular kind of society, unquote. Naipaul frames the act of book production in a wonderfully evocative and effective way, which I will quote once again from that same essay. And he says, but books are not created just in the mind. Books are physical objects. To write them, you need a certain kind of sensibility. You need a language and a certain gift of a language. And you need to possess a particular literary form. To get your name on the spine of the created physical object, you need a vast apparatus outside of yourself. You need publishers, editors, designers, printers, binders, booksellers, critics, newspapers, magazines, and of course, buyers and readers. And as well, he might have added, you need libraries of private merchants and others who read books. So what is it that I like about this Naipaul passage that I keep on coming back to again and again? what I like about this meditation, I have to say, is its hard-nosed emphasis on the materiality of the book, on the simple fact that to materialize before readers, books need a vast apparatus of printers, publishers, binders, book manufacturers, distributors, and so on. And of course, I might also add referee writers for your books. Your books just don't appear just like that. You need a whole host of people to support you and a whole host of societal network that makes it possible for the book to appear in the first place. And so what I've tried to do in my book, Early Modernity and Mobility, is to apply this kind of Napoleon sensibility to my retelling of the history of the Armenian printed codex. So having finished just a small segment from the conclusion of my book, I will now shift to my PowerPoint presentation and improvise as I go along with the help of some minimal text as well as images. So, all right. Shape and spine of my book. This is an introduction of the book, and of course, the word spine was chosen on purpose because of the V.S. Naipaul passage. To get my name on the spine of my book, I needed a whole host of people to support me, friends, colleagues, family. I needed university presses to be interested. I needed letter writers to get my book to be considered as valuable and worthy enough of being published and so forth. So books may appear to be like an isolated individual element that is a product that are the products of one's creative imagination. But in fact, the more one looks at a book, the more its magic becomes plain to all of us to see, which is that the book involves a whole host of social relationships that don't always appear in the contents of the book itself. So my own book, how did I begin writing? What made me write this book would be a good place to start with the remainder of my book talk today. So obviously, I should say from the very outset, the best kind of knowledge is self-knowledge, is knowledge that starts from the self, from one's own personal private history and so on. And I think this also applies in the case of the book I have written, because it's very much a personal book. I have worked on it for 10 full years while teaching at UCLA, a full load of teaching as well, and traveling across multiple spaces, countries, and archives. I'm also someone who comes from a family of printers. Printing is not an alien thing for me. I grew up with the smell of printing ink in my nostrils. For those of you who may not know me, I'm from Ethiopia originally. I'm an Armenian from Ethiopia, and both on my maternal and paternal side, printing runs in our family. So my maternal grandfather, George Jerayan, owned the first printing press in Ethiopia, the first privately operated printing press. Up until the 70s, it was up neck to neck with the government-owned printing press in terms of the scale and magnitude of my grandfather's accomplishment. My father was also a very important printer in Ethiopia. So what I have to write here draws from personal experience, from all sorts of olfactory memories and so on of ink. I remember growing up as a little kid in Ethiopia and so forth. So the book has taken me 10 years to write. I have traveled to 33 archives across the world, maybe in 13, 14, 15 countries. I'm not sure. I haven't really counted the countries, but I've worked in 33 archives and at least in 13 or 12 cemeteries, the majority of which were in India. Cemeteries of graveyards are, of course, a form of archive. They're not recognized as such, but they are. So let me say a few words before I give you a larger kind of appreciation, perhaps, of some of the contents of my book. And let me just say a few more words. Let me say a few words about l'histoire du livre, a professional kind of a style of writing a book history that was shaped by the Annales School of Historiography that I've alluded to, but I have not elaborated on until now. So let me just say a couple of quick things and then move on so that you get the context and the framework of the book in place. So basically, Histoire du Livre is a distinct style of writing the history of books, not the history of printing, but the history of books. That goes back to this book on the right side of your screen here, L'apparition du livre, authored by Henri-Jean Martin, who was the co-founder of the Annales School of Historiography. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I should say the book was authored by Lucien Febvre, the co-founder of the Annales School, along with Marc Bloch, and his student, at the time a librarian, by the name of Henri-Jean Martin, who collaborated, the two of them collaborated together. They published this book called The Coming of the Book, published in 1993 in English, in a very fine English translation. And this book it's very difficult to exaggerate the importance of this book in the field of study that I've been working in for the past 10 years. And that is to say that this book, published in 1958, essentially changed the way historians look at book history and the history of print culture. And the way that it changed the way historians look at it is by emphasizing and putting emphasis on certain types of sources in the archives that other people haven't looked at, and shifting the object of analysis from the printing press itself as an object, as a material object to study, to the printing press and its role in creating the history of the book. And so the Annales School of Historians in France, they've been around since 1929 when their journal called Annales was published. They basically, from 58 onwards, changed the way people study the history of publishing and books. And so one of the ways in which they've changed this is by focusing on the impact of reading, the impact of the book on the reader itself. They're not interested in who set up printing presses in this location, at what point in time, and so on. And so they're interested in how the book was printed as an economic object, how the book itself as a commodity was transported across great distances, and how eventually it made its way into the hands of consumers, of readers of books. And so the French school looks at sources such as notarial records to look at how much books cost to produce. They look at all sorts of archival sources that are basically bottom-up kind of archives of social history. They also look at private libraries or merchants to see what kind of books people in the 18th century were actually reading. It's not enough just to know that such and such a book was published or so many books were published. It's important to know who actually read these books, how they read them, and how the act of reading books transformed the reader's imagination and place in this world. And so the French school does all of these things, and it does so by emphasizing particular types of sources. And I've called this, in my book, Frenchness in the history of the book. And I've used the term from Roger Chartier, the last of the great annal historians still around. Roger Chartier is a prominent and prolific scholar of the history of books in general, in Europe in general. And in one of his famous essays delivered at the American Book History Association a number of decades ago, Chartier developed this notion of Frenchness. And the essay that he gave, the keynote, is called What is Frenchness in the History of Books? And by Frenchness, what Chartier meant to say, what he explained, had to do with the methodological insights of the Annales School. Frenchness means the idea of studying statistically available information on the number of books that were published at a certain time, what kind of genres these publications fell in terms of whether they were religious books, whether they were secular, whether they approached certain types of certain ways of being, and so forth. And these are things that I think are not really there in the way that the history of printing has been pursued in Yerevan or in other places, particularly among Armenians, for many, many decades. And there, the term Armenianness, which I've coined for the book, deals with a different kind of analysis, which doesn't look at notarial records. It doesn't look at prices of books, how much they cost, who read them. It doesn't look at libraries, how merchants read books and what kind of books they read and how they changed, how that changed their mindset. None of these questions are raised in the Yerevan-based scholarship, but nonetheless, the Yerevan-based scholarship, without which none of this scholarship could have existed, to be honest with you, has made huge contributions, and the contributions made by them, by this kind of Armenianness in the history of books, has to do with the focus on colophons, which are basically memorials at the end of books, which detail who was the benefactor of the book, how much they spent. Sometimes they give information on prices, how many copies were printed, and so forth. So colophons are important, but colophons, of course, only give you a very small sliver of the image that you're looking for. To get a broader perspective, one needs to get one's boots muddy in the archives, and one needs to look at all sorts of diversity of sources that are only found in the archives. So, which is basically what I've tried to do in my book. So, what are the major arguments of the book that I think, what are the arguments that deserve to be slightly elaborated upon? And I argue that my book makes three distinct contributions to a larger scholarship. It's a very big book, 585 pages, obviously 10 years of writing and research. So I make three distinct contributions to the scholarship. First contribution, and I'm going to go over them very quickly now, and I'll go into some detail into at least two of the three contributions, because I don't want to run out of time, and I also wanted to give you a slightly different lecture than the ones I've given in the past regarding this book. So the three major contributions are: first, my book makes a contribution to studying, as I mentioned earlier, how the early modern Armenian diaspora evolved in the first place. How was it conceived? How did it come about? At what point did the early modern Armenian diaspora emerge? And what role did forced migrations, or what I call in the book the twin detonations of forced mobility, play in the birthing of this early modern diaspora, is a question that I pursue at great length in the first segment, the first third of the book. So there I argue that there were two kinds of forced mobilities that occurred in the Armenian homeland in the late 18th century, 17th century, which I'll get to in a second. I don't want to give away too much. The second important contribution my book makes is it asks the question, why did the Armenians, for the first time in the around 15, let's say, the first Armenian book appears in Venice in 1512. Why did the Armenians in the 16th century decide as a collective to pursue the printing revolution? Why did they adopt and adapt the printing revolution for their own culture? This is the main question that I have in the book. And of course, it's a question that you would think would have been answered a long time ago, but I tried to come up with my own version of an answer to this question. And the version that I have is that Armenians shifted from scribal production, that is to say, producing manuscripts by hand, to mechanical reproduction, to use a Walter Benjaminian phrase, through the means of the printing press itself in the early modern period, and were fully behind this revolution, fully. In other cases, other societies did not support such a revolution. The Armenians did. So the question is why? Why did they make this shift from scribal to mechanical? And here, I'll talk about that in a short while. I'll give you a short version of my answer to this question of the shift from manuscript to print, from the inkwell to the lead type. So that's the second contribution I make. The third contribution I make in my book, probably I would say the more challenging one, and the one that's worth more than the other two, is the contribution of arguing that once the printing revolution was embraced by the Armenians and their church, the question then becomes, why did they continue it for such a long time? Why did they pursue it at such lengths? And so the answer to this question, of course, that I have is that the reason why Armenian book history exists in the first place is because in the very same period, in the early modern period, when the Armenians are embracing the printing revolution, one witnesses this flourishing of this kind of development of certain policies pursued by states and their agents, policies that are called nowadays confessionalism. And basically, I'll just give you a 20-second summary of confessionalism. I'm not going to get into it that much in the remainder of my talk. The bulk of my book is on that, but I've talked about this in my other lectures. So I'm going to just say a few words now, and then I'll move on to the first two contributions that I make in the book. And so confessionalism is basically a shorthand term for to explain the tension between the Armenian Apostolic or Gregorian Church versus other types of churches in Christendom. And the big argument I try to make in the book is that Armenians have been misunderstood in the sense that most people have talked about Armenians as an ethno-religious community. My argument in my book is that Armenians probably have never been an ethno-religious community. They have almost always been an ethno-confessional community. That is to say, their sense of understanding of themselves is based on their church and its teachings and its doctrines and its liturgy and its values. It's confession, in short. What makes the Armenian church distinct from the Catholic Church? What makes the Armenian distinct from the Georgian Church north of Armenia? What makes the Armenians distinct from the Byzantine or Greek, so-called Greek Orthodox Church? These are the questions that I pursue at great length in my book. And my argument is that in the same period as printing was coming around, was developing, the Armenian church faced a life or death struggle against the Church of Rome that had been sending missionaries to the east to make up for losses in Europe. The Catholic Church, of course, as we should know, underwent this period in the 16th century where the Protestant Reformation occurred. Of course, the Protestant Reformation made a significant impact on the Catholic Church in terms of taking away many of their followers and so on, and developing a new kind of confession, a new religion, a new Christian sense of confessional identity that was Protestant in its many different forms across Europe. And of course, the 16th century is a century of religious warfare, 17th century as well to some extent. And this period of Catholic versus Protestant tension is referred to as confessionalism or confessionalization in this period. And my argument in the book is that this same kind of intra-Christian kind of dynamics that shaped Europe happened within Armenians themselves vis-a-vis the Church of Rome. And it's this tension from the Church of Rome versus the Armenian Church that acts like the driving engine of Armenian book history. So the question, if somebody were to ask, why did the Armenian Church print so many books? Well, I should have said first and foremost that the church, of course, is one cannot minimize or pretend that the role of the Armenian church is not fundamental to understanding Armenian history. And I'm saying this not as someone who's a churchgoer. Anyone who knows me knows better. But I'm saying this as a historian, that the role of the church and the confession of the Armenian church is absolutely critical to understanding Armenian history, Armenian collective identity, and especially Armenian print history, or the history of the Armenian book. So let me now very quickly go over some of the first contribution I make, which is that I use book history as an optic to study larger developments in Armenian history. I'm not interested in the history of printing as an end in itself. That's been done dozens of times in the past. Some of those attempts have actually been exceptionally good, produced and published in Yerevan for the most part, but also in the diaspora. But I'm not interested in that. Other people have done that before me, and I've profited. I'm grateful that I exist after these people have come. So I've profited from them to write my own book, but my personal intervention is not printing presses as such, but in using the book itself as an optic to understand a much larger reality. And that larger reality for me is the reality of the birth of the early modern Armenian diaspora. And I basically argue in a nutshell that the early modern world, and I should say a couple of things about the early modern world for those who are not historians. Early modernity, or the early modern world, the early modern period in world history, is essentially a period that extends from 1500 to 1800 for most of the world. It's a period in which new changes occur, like state formation becomes really pronounced, mobility becomes extremely pronounced, economic linkages and networks across the world become pronounced. The world basically becomes more and more like the world we live in, beginning in the 1500 to 1800 phase of world history. But of course, that phase, which is called the early modern period in world history doesn't mechanically apply to the Armenians. History is much more complex than mechanically taking an argument or a periodization scheme from one culture or community and slapping it onto another. In the Armenian case, one has to, the early modern world does occur for the Armenians. The Armenians are pulled into the early modern world, but the early modern world comes to them through two unusually violent developments that occurs in the Armenian homeland, or in the homeland, or in the land where the Armenians, majority of the Armenians lived. And of course, that land is Eastern Asia Minor, which is now Eastern Turkey, of course, and parts of the South Caucasus. So Eastern Asia Minor was the area where Armenians, the Armenian homeland was located. It's around here somewhere. Most of you know this, but in the period from 1597 to 1607, a 10-year window of world history, we can pretty much focus on that period and see the gestation, the early developments of the early modern world for the Armenians. So if we look really closer at this period of 1597 to 1607, a 10-year period in world history, as I've mentioned before, we see that the Armenian plateau, or the eastern fringes of Asia Minor where the Armenians lived, the Armenian homeland basically experienced two very violent detonations of forced mobility, as I call them in my book. These two violent detonations of forced mobility resulted in the birth of the early modern world for the Armenians in the form of both Eastern Armenians and Western Armenians. So these two, the first of these two forced detonations of mobility have to do with a movement that occurs in the Ottoman Empire known as the Jalali uprisings that occur, roughly speaking, from 1590 to 1620, but 1597 to 1607 is the window that concerns Armenians the most. And this is because during this period, a large number of Ottoman troops, general commanders, and so on, or people who worked for the Ottomans in the Ottoman army, rebelled against the empire itself, largely due to developments in world history that had been taking place in the New World. In what is today Bolivia, in 1545, the Spanish conquistadors discovered the largest silver mine in the history of the world in a place called Potosi. And that silver mine produced basically about 80% of the world's silver came from one major free of charge silver mine that the conquistadors basically exploited with the help of indigenous and African slave labor, and they supplied the world's economy with silver. And when this silver went around the world, it caused tremendous consequences, deleterious consequences for a number of states. And one of those consequences was that it led to devaluation of currencies, to out of control inflation and so forth, because of the sudden amount of influx of silver coming from the New World. And in the Ottoman Empire, when the silver arrived from Spain, one of the consequences was that the akçe, the silver currency at the time, was devalued multiple times, and the Ottomans themselves had to pay four times what they had to pay usually to maintain their troops and so on. And this, of course, led to friction. And before too long, in the 1590s, a bunch of bandits or rebels, seen from the state's point of view, organized a series of uprisings in the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Those provinces happened to be where the Armenians lived and where their homeland was located. And so, as a result of continuous uprisings against the Ottoman state and looting and banditry in the eastern provinces, a great number of people fled for security and safety in safer areas of the Ottoman Empire. That is to say, in places like Constantinople, Tekirdağ, which is basically Rodosta was the name. Today it's called Tekirdağ, Izmir, Smyrna, all these places, Constantinople, Tekirdağ, Rodosta, and Smyrna became the hubs and the nuclei for a Western Armenian diaspora, because the people who were living in the frontier zone in the east and were faced suddenly with these Jalali uprisings, left in large numbers, somewhere around 40,000 to 60,000 people, and fled in a movement that Ottoman historiography refers to as a Buyuk Kaçgın, which is to say the large flight. So a number of people basically fled to safety outside of the areas where the Jalalis had been working their marauding, or engaged in marauding and other types of destabilizing activities. So this was the first movement of Armenians from the eastern provinces, in this case to the west. These people were mostly Western Armenians. They went and settled down in Istanbul, Rodosto, and Izmir, and there they gave birth to what we today call the Western Armenian diaspora, the diaspora that I come from myself. And most of us, I think, who are Armenian, I would say a good many of us are also from this diaspora. And this diaspora, it's important to say, has its particular birthplace. It's in Western Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, places like Constantinople, Smyrna, and Rodosto. These were the places where the Western Armenian diaspora came to develop as its own kind of distinct community as a result of the Jalali uprisings. But Jalalis were not alone in their marauding activities. Their explosion on the scene coincided with a war between Iran and the Ottoman Empire at this time. Iran, of course, is governed by the Safavid dynasty of Shia Muslims. They waged the greatest Safavid ruler of the time, of all time perhaps, Shah Abbas I, took the opportunity of the Jalali uprisings in the eastern fringes of the Ottoman Empire, which weakened the foundations of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire almost collapsed during this period. So Shah Abbas I took advantage of this and wanted to recoup some losses that his predecessors, 2 or 3 Shahs before him, had lost to the Ottomans. The Ottomans and the Safavids had fought 4 or 5 major wars across the 1500s. It was a century of nonstop war almost, at least as far as the people who lived on the boundaries of these 2 empires were concerned. So in the course of these wars, the Safavids had lost one war after another. So when Shah Abbas came to the throne in 1585-87, and then when he witnessed the instability on the Ottoman frontier and the weakness of the Ottomans vis-a-vis the Jalali uprisings and bandits, Shah Abbas I decided to wage war against the Ottomans exactly when the time was right. And so in 1603, he moved his forces into the frontier zone of the empires, the 2 empires where the Armenians lived. And as a result, when faced by an Ottoman counterattack from Constantinople, Shah Abbas realized that he didn't have enough forces to put up a stiff resistance to them. So he did what most monarchs of his period or the period before that used, which is to say that he relied on scorched earth policy. That is to say, razing the countryside to the ground, just burning the whole place down, and forcibly removing and repopulating and displacing forcibly approximately 300,000 Armenians and others from the frontier zone with their entire families and retinues, and driving them by force into Iran, where the Shah resettled them, most of these Armenians, in the Caspian Sea on the southern shores, where they worked to produce silk, to cultivate the silk industry. But many of them died as a result of the pestilential diseases and so forth. But Shah Abbas I was also really clairvoyant enough or smart enough to realize that some of the Armenians that he forcibly deported needed to be taken care of with special attention. And those some Armenians were involved in the silk trade, and they lived in a small town known as Old Julfa. You can see it right here. It's on the Safavid-Ottoman frontier. It's a town where the merchants had specialized in silk and the sale of Iranian raw silk to European markets. And so the Shah took the small community of Armenian merchants in Julfa, Old Julfa as it came to be known afterwards, and forcibly also joined them to the deportees. But for them, he made an exception. He treated them with kid gloves, unlike the others, and he moved them and personally settled them on the other bank of the river Zayande in the Safavid imperial capital, Isfahan, that had just been established as a capital not too long before this event. So there in 1603, 1604, out of the 300,000 Armenians that were deported into Iran, Armenians and others, about 10 or 15,000 of them who were very well known as silk merchants prior to the wars in the 15th century. Basically, these 10, 15,000 people the Shah treated with extraordinary privileges, moved them to his capital, resettled them on the other side of the river, and gave them a whole township, which they named after their old evacuated town as New Julfa. And so these two things are important, these two detonations of forced mobility, as I call them, the Jalalis and Shah Abbas's deportations, which are also known with another kind of Turkish moniker. In this case, it's known as a buyuk, not kaçgın, which is the flight or fleeing of people, but the buyuk sürgün, which is the great deportations, basically. In Armenian, the term they used in some cases is bırni kaht, or they also say med surgün, the great surgün. So basically, 300,000 Armenians moved into Iran, and these two detonations together, I argue in my book, gave birth to the early modern Armenian diaspora, consisting of Western Armenians who went to establish a long-distance network of settlements in decades subsequent to their forced mobility, and Western Armenian merchants who also left their new hometowns in Constantinople and other places, Izmir and so on, and also went to establish trading connections in the port cities in Europe, especially. And there, in the port city locations across this world that the early modern Armenian diaspora created, the two wings, the two branches of the Armenian diaspora, the Western Armenian diaspora of Ottoman Armenians for the most part, and the Eastern Armenian diaspora of Iranian Armenians for the most part, came to join together in port cities maybe 2 or 3 decades after the initial deportations drove their ancestors from their homes into these new locations, Iran or the Ottoman Empire. And so in the 1650s, already 1660s, you have both Eastern and Western Armenians congregating in port cities. And for this reason, because they're both Western and Eastern and different from each other, I use the term port Armenian to describe these two communities that operate in conjunction with one another in port city locations. So of course, all of this talk brings up the question as to why port cities are important. Are they important? Is there something to the port city argument that I've been using all this time? And of course, I would say yes, there's a great deal to that argument. And to explain it, I've come up with a shorthand way of remembering, easy to remember formula to explain why the port cities are important. I call this the PPP connection, or the PPP factor. That is to say, Port Armenian is the first P, port city is the second P, and printer is the third P. The PPPs always go together for Armenians, for the most part. And so what are these? So how do we approach this? Well, one way of doing that is by quickly reciting some basic facts. Basic facts are that between 1512 and 1800, Armenian printing presses owned and operated by Armenians sprang up in 21 different locations around the world. Here I only have 19, which is what I used in my book, but apparently I left out 2. But it doesn't really change my argument in any way whatsoever. But the basic, when I looked at these printing locations where the Armenians printed books, of course you can see it on the left side of on the left side of the screen here. See the 19 locations, from the first one in Venice, 1512, and so on. Istanbul or Constantinople, second Rome, Livorno, Julfa, and so on. You see that out of the 19 locations, if you stare at them long enough, you will find the pattern. And what is that pattern? You will see. The pattern is that out of 19 locations, 15 or 16 out of 21 or 15 out of 19 are clearly in port cities. There seems to be something going on here. The first time I looked at this 10 years ago, I was like, I can't believe no one has ever written on this, because as far as I could tell, at least, that I thought if you look at it long enough, there's a pattern. And whenever you see patterns, you realize that there's something deeper going on in history. It's not just a fluke. It's not a coincidence that 15 out of 19 places are port city locations. What does this mean? Why is this the case, is what I asked. And of course, I realized that out of the 15 locations, 78%, 79% are port city locations, but they involve two kinds of port cities. Maritime port cities, which is what most people think about when they think about port cities. There's port cities on the edges of oceans and seas, but there are also fluvial port cities, that is to say, riverine port cities. And of course, riverine port cities are important, just as important as the others, because at the end of the day, what matters, we will see, is that transportation is important. Transportation is a key attribute of port cities that gives port cities an advantage over other kinds of cities, particularly when it comes to shipping commodities across long distances. So why you might ask, is there such a connection between port Armenians, port cities, and printers? What attracted printers to port cities is another way of asking this question. Of course, the answer to this question is threefold, and I'll quickly go over them now. I spent a good part of my book dealing with this, the first third of the book. And basically, there are three reasons, I argue, why port cities are important. Why there is a 79% correlation between port cities and printers, or printing presses for the Armenians. And the reasons are, first, that, of course, printers, who are almost always religious people, the printers for the Armenians have almost always been hailing from the upper echelons of the Armenian Apostolic or Gregorian Church. Why do they hail from this church? Well, because people who are high officials in the church, including doctors of theology, vartabeds, or deacons, and so on, were more likely to be literate than others. Of course, they knew their literature, they knew Armenian culture, literary culture better than anybody else, and merchants, of course, for the most part, were illiterate. So printers always, for the most part, came from the church. And printers are always attracted to port cities. So why is that the case? Well, first, because port cities are important to printers because port cities already came supplied with a diasporic infrastructure, because port Armenians lived in port cities and they had a diasporic infrastructure in place, ready to go. That is to say, a church. First thing that any Armenian did when he or she went to a foreign distance, if there are like 5 or 6 of them, they had a church. Sometimes they had 2 churches. And what is worse, sometimes they had 2 churches with 5 people simultaneously at the same time, not like within 40 years of each other. So this first thing is that port cities came with an establishment, a prepackaged port Armenian diasporic facilities to help printers. The second reason why ports were important for printers is because ports attracted technical experts, without whom, no matter how hard you tried, you could never print anything. And that is to say, port cities usually attracted technical technical elites of the time that dealt with things such as punch cutting, so that you could build punches, so that you could arrange lead type. Printing, of course, is based on movable lead type. But to create the lead type and to create printed books, you need to first find a specialist who can actually design fonts for you. And once they design the font, you need to get another specialist to design punches. Punches are metal things that are used to impress a shape onto a matrix into which tin and lead are melted. And once that is done, you have lead type, which is arranged on a stick, and then you print books with that by applying ink, of course. So I'm summarizing it very quickly, but essentially you get the picture. So the second important thing is that, of course, technical experts always lived near port cities. They didn't live in the countryside. They didn't live in some remote place in the world. They lived in the cutting edge centers of the global economy, which for the most part in the early modern period almost perfectly overlapped with the port city layout of the world economy. Third, not to be, and certainly not least, of course, you have ports offering printers with unmatchable maritime transportation networks. So if you wanted to build a printing press if you're an Armenian in 1600s, you want to start a printing press, you don't go to a place like Diyarbakir or Amid or I don't know, what's another remote location, let's say, not known for technological prowess. So you wouldn't go to any of these locations. You would go to a port city in Europe, because that's where the craft of printing was developing. And of course, there you would establish a printing press, and of course, you'd be thinking about selling your books. Nobody prints books for the sake of just printing. Okay, some people do if they have a cause that they want to pursue. But nonetheless, even if you have a cause, you still have to break even in order to continue printing. So you need to worry about how the books are being shipped, who's reading them, who's buying them, etc. And of course, when it comes to shipping, nothing beats maritime transportation. It's always cheaper, more efficient, and involves less taxes, because when you travel across seas, especially if you have a cannon on your ships, you don't have to pay taxes at every zone that you cross. Whereas overland transportation has that added element of paying more money for taxes and customs and so on. So now let me quickly give you two case studies, and I will wrap up afterwards. So the case studies that I have for the larger argument of the book that I present have to do with the two exceptional case studies are Amsterdam, which proves my point about the port city location, and Julfa, which was an exception, but it's an exception that also proves the rule. So I have these two case studies that I'll talk about very quickly now. And Amsterdam is particularly special for me because Amsterdam was the most important printing center for the Armenians in the early modern period, from basically 1557. I'm sorry, 1650. This is a mistake. From 1660 until approximately 1717, Amsterdam operated as an unmatched, peerless center for Armenian books. Some of the best printed books in the world were printed in Amsterdam, and the most transformative ones as well, in terms of commerce, theology, philosophy, and so on, all printed in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is also very important because the first Bible in Armenian was printed in Amsterdam the first time in 1666 to 1668. The first Armenian Bible came off the press in Amsterdam. So Amsterdam is really important. Who were the founders of the Amsterdam press, one might ask? Of course, one might also answer by saying that the founders of the Armenian press in Amsterdam are actually people who hailed from a very troubled region of the world today, a region that many Armenians are very, very concerned about these days. And that is, of course, I'm talking about the conflict with Azerbaijan involving Nagorno-Karabakh and so on, and also Nakhichevan. So the first founder of the Amsterdam press was a man by the name of Mateusz Tsaretsi, Matthew of Tsar, who traveled in 1555, approximately 1655. Forgive the typo on my PowerPoint. 1655-56. Mateusz was sent by the Armenian Catholicos of the time. Hagop Jogaetzi, greatest Catholicos probably of his time, maybe of all time. Mateusz was sent by Hagop Jogaetzi to Amsterdam, to Rome, to Italy, to start thinking about printing the Armenian Bible. The most important goal for the Armenian church at this point was to print the Bible. The Armenians did not have Bibles, and the reasons why they shifted from scribal to mechanical production, I should say, was because printed books are much cheaper and faster and more efficient and more standardized than manuscripts. And of course, for the Armenians in this whole period that we're talking about, the primary goal for the Armenian church was to resort to the printing press as a way of fighting against the Catholics who were preaching and winning lots of souls from the Armenians to their own confessional brand of Christian, to their own confessional, to their own confession, basically. So Mateusz of Tsar was sent by the Catholicos of the Armenian Church in 1650s. He went to Italy. The Italian peninsula was where most of the technology of print had shifted from northern Germany to Italy in this period of the 1500s, and so on. And so Matthäus, like other Armenians, were sent first to Italy to see, in Rome especially, to see if they could acquire some Armenian types, which are very rare, very difficult to get a hold of. And so Matthäus arrives in Venice, and then he goes to Rome, like many other Armenians prior to him had also traveled to. And his goal was to find support so that he could print the Armenian Bible. And of course, after spending a few years in Italy, especially in Rome, and being given the cold shoulder by specialists who were able to produce Armenian type, Matthäus finally realized that there was something wrong with his decision to be in Italy. And at some point in the 1650s, he realized that he was in the wrong country, because at every step he was meeting an obstacle. Every step he would take, there would be an opposition to his printing the Bible and so on. And of course, it dawned on him that this is the wrong country. I've come to the wrong place. I'm never going to be able to print books here because nobody's giving me any support. It's almost like somebody's telling people not to support or collaborate with Armenian printers. And so at some point in the 1650s, the light bulb went off in Matthäus's head, and Matthäus decided to go to a safer and more favorable place to conduct his enterprise. And that was, of course, the Low Countries or Amsterdam or Holland, Protestant Holland in the north, with its majestic capital of Amsterdam, the peerless capital of global trade that as every Armenian knew at that time. And so there, Matthäus is the first Armenian to go to Amsterdam in 1657. He arrives in Amsterdam, realizes that he's being checked at every step he takes in Italy because of censorship by the church. And in Amsterdam, of course, there's much less censorship because it's not a Catholic society. It's not centralized, it's a federated system. And so Matthäus arrives, and before too long, he meets a Port Armenian in Amsterdam, an Armenian from Iran, I forget from exactly where, probably from Julfa, who then tells him that he would introduce him to a punch cutter, to one of the most prolific, one of the most talented punch cutters and letter cutters in history, in fact. A man by the name of Christoffel van Dyck, who is a preeminent punch cutter and letter designer in the world at this time. He works for the Elsevier firm, very well-known firm of publishers and so on. And he designs Armenian fonts for Matthäus. Of course, it costs a significant amount of investment for Matthäus. He falls into debts. He borrows some money from other merchants and so on. And then as he's about to die in 1660, his first book is coming off the press. It's called Jesus the Son. And as it's coming off the press, Matthäus is in his deathbed and suddenly finds himself face to face with another Port Armenian, in this case, a man by the name of Avedis Ligensi, who is from Julfa and who has a brother who's a priest from Echmiadzin who preaches at the Armenian church outside of Yerevan, not too far from Yerevan today, a place called Ushi, the monastery of Ushi. And so that priest, the brother of Avedis Ligensi, is none other than the most formidable Armenian of the last 500 years, probably. I tend to exaggerate when I like people. But Voskan Yerevanci is his name. He's the guy who prints the first Armenian Bible. Okay? And Voskan travels from Yerevan. 1664, he arrives in Amsterdam. 1666 to 68, he's already accomplished what has eluded every other Armenian printer before him. That is to say, he produces the first Armenian Bible. You can see a photo of it here on the bottom right. And he produces a number of other books as well. In 1669, 1670, he moves to Livorno with his press. Then from Livorno, he moves to Marseille, where he produces more books. But last but not least, the third major printer of Amsterdam is Matthäus Hovannisian, and his uncle, his cousin, Thomas van Andeti, also major printers and intellectuals of their time, who set up Amsterdam's last two printing presses. So in a period of 50, 60 years, from 1660 until 1717, Amsterdam has 4 consecutive Armenian printing presses running with a hiatus of only 10 years or 15 years in the middle. So, and of course, they produce, how many books do they produce? Well, they publish 60,000 books in 50 years. And of course, all of this, and while they're doing this, they have 2 churches. I mentioned churches earlier. They have 2 churches, okay? But luckily for them, they're saving grace. They have a 40-year difference between them. They're not at the same time. So the question, of course, is how many Armenians were living in Amsterdam that they were able to accomplish this much? How many? I'm going to pick on somebody, but if they've seen any other lectures I've given, they might know the answer. But Dikram, I'm going to choose one. I'm going to pick on you. How many Armenians do you think lived in Amsterdam? Take a guess.
100.
1860. Huh?
100.
That's not bad. That's not bad. Close, close. I thought they were going to say 5,000 or 10,000, which is what most people would think. No, 60 Armenians lived there. 40 to 60, period. Not more. At the same time, 60 Armenians lived in Amsterdam, 2 churches, 4 printing presses. But like I said, the churches, one was in 1662, the other one was in 1714. So, and of course, I'll say a few words about the printing, about Julfan print, and I'll just very quickly, I'll just say that the major importance of Julfa for printing, for Armenian printing, is that it opened the first printing press in the history of Iran was opened and operated in Julfa in 1636. That's fairly early, 1636 to 1642. Julfa, like Amsterdam, had several printing presses, 3 in fact. It had a small population, although not 40, but it had not that much. I mean, it had 20,000 people at the most, maybe 30 at its peak. But they produced a number of very important books, and they financed nearly all of the production of books that happened. Most of the production of books was financed by Julfan merchants. So in Julfa itself, Khachadur Gesarati is the most important person. He's the primate of New Julfa. He visits Lvov, which is an exception as well, along with Julfa, inland location where the Armenians have a church. Of course, a church, but they also have a very important printing press in the early part of the 1600s. So Khachadur Gesarati visits Lvov in 1630 to resolve some conflict between the Catholics and the Armenian church involving confessionalism. And that's where he sees the Armenian printing press and printing in Latin script and so on. And he goes back to Julfa. He's appointed the primate of Julfa, and there he establishes the first printing press in 1636, publishes the first book in 1638. Only 1 copy of that book is left. It has survived. It's in Oxford. We don't have one here, but we have 2 or 3 of the Julfan books here in our YRL library, the rare books department. So, but of course, the main reason I'm bringing up Khachadur Gesarati is because in Julfa itself, it's an inland location, not a port city, obviously. So the question is, how did they do it? How did this seems to prove the opposite of what I'm saying, because it's not a port city, and yet they had a printing tradition. Was it a successful printing tradition? That's a question one needs to ask, and I would argue that it wasn't as successful as it could have been, precisely because it wasn't a port city. And so, after printing for a number of years, printing books, Khachadur basically decided to send one of his priests to Europe so that he could learn and perfect the art of printing, because he was having problems with the ink type. He was having problems with the lead types. He didn't have lead type, he had wood type, which wasn't productive or efficient enough, and so on. So he sends one of his students, a very sad priest by the name of Hovannisian, who travels to Venice and then Rome. In some ways, he's sort of like, this is around the same time as the printing press in Amsterdam. So he travels, Hovannisian travels to Rome, just like Mateusz Tsaretsi. And there he also realizes that nobody is helping him with fonts. There's a German font cutter, letter cutter, and so on, but he refuses to work with him at first, and then he joins them. They move to Livorno together at some point in the 1640s, and Hovhannes there, after the German guy cuts fonts for him, he produces the first printed book in Livorno, an Armenian book, a Psalter, of course, 1644, and then returns to Julfa, carrying with him on 2 camels a huge contraption of the printing press, the wooden press. And of course, by the time the press arrives in Julfa, it's an incredibly hard ordeal. You can see the travels of Hovannisian down here on the map. It's probably too small, but nonetheless, the man goes through incredible ordeals, finally manages to get a printing machine transported to Julfa with camels and so on via the overland route through through Jerusalem, by way of Jerusalem and so on, across the desert. And when he arrives in Isfahan, he finds his master, Khachadur Gesarati, dead. Khachadur was a big believer in print culture, in the printing press. But the people who had succeeded him turn out to be adamantly against printing because they believe in manuscripts. So they basically, after this poor man has basically tortured himself for 10-something years or so, traveling to Europe, printing books in Livorno and coming back with a printing press in Iran, he realizes that the people who have stayed behind are actually Luddites of sorts. They're against printing technology. They forced him to break down his press. Hovhannes dies in 1650, a few years later, in Old Julfa. But of course, then another printer, another primate of New Julfa, Stepanos Jogaeti, a really very ardent persecutor of Catholic Armenians, comes to the throne in 1686 or so, and he decides to resuscitate the old press from Khachadur Gesarati's days. And of course, he realizes that he can't print quality books because he doesn't have the fonts, he doesn't have the paper. You need to have European paper to print books because in this period, paper from Central Asia, which is what was used in Iran at this point, was not conducive to printing because the minute the press came down on the paper, it shattered a paper if it wasn't sturdy enough, I suppose. So, but Stepanos Jogaeti, realizing that he's not going to succeed, sends numerous letters to Port Armenians in Venice and Livorno. None of them actually agreed to help him. And I suspect it's because the people that receive these letters are very well aware that they're Armenian, Apostolic Armenians or Gregorian Armenians living in Europe in a confessionalized environment where the Catholic Church is persecuting and so on. And so none of them respond to Stepanos Jogaeti's pleas for help and pleas for sending requests to have papers sent to Iran, requests to have lead types manufactured and so on sent to Iran. None of them respond, and so the printing press closes down in 1692. The next time a printing press opens up in Isfahan, it's in 1860s, and it's a smaller press. It's not this kind of, you can see here on the right side, this is the old wooden press of the old days of Gutenberg era printing, where you press down or pull down the press. And this is an 1809 model of a printing press known as a Stanhope press, which is more compact, easily transportable. You don't have to take it apart and put it back together when it travels across 2,000 miles on camel caravans and so on. So I'll just end here. I don't have time to talk about confessionalization, but if you have any questions about confessionalization and the role of the confessional nation, which is an argument I have in the book as well about why Armenian nationalism cannot be understood without confession, and why you cannot understand confession and nation without print technology. That's a big, basically, it's a major contribution I have in the book. So if you have any questions, you can ask me that. You can ask me now. You can ask me now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebouh, for this fascinating talk. Now, floor is open if you have questions. Yes, Dikran.
Okay, since you finished with confessionalism, what percentage of the printers were Armenian Apostolic and what percentage were Catholics?
Of the readers?
On the printers, yeah.
Of the printers. Okay, so we don't have exact numbers, obviously.
Yeah.
But you're getting the main point, which is that obviously in this conflict, confessional conflict between the Armenian and Roman churches, both sides appealed to their merchants for help. The Armenian side had the help of Port Armenians, Apostolics or Gregorians. And of course, there are also a considerable number of Catholic Armenians. So both sides, both the Catholics and the Apostolics, basically relied on the print on printing as a technology to disseminate their message and to either fortify the teachings of the Armenian Church and make the boundaries between the Armenian confession and the confessional tenets of the Roman Church very hard. So in either case, both sides resorted to printers. As to how many each side had, I don't know. But I would suspect, I don't know. Daniel, have you come across anything like that in your own?
But it'll take me 3 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, well, you can work on it while we're, anybody else? And
So were there differences in the fraction of Armenians who were literate between the apostolics and Catholics?
who was more literate, you mean?
Yeah, who was, I mean, many were not able to read, I assume.
Yes, literacy levels at this time obviously are crucial. Very, very low. Literacy among Armenians, among most people in the world until the 19th century, we're talking about very low literacy levels. And the Armenians particularly low because, not because we're illiterate, the opposite, but because Armenians are very small in numbers. To go back to a small nation that Taner referred to earlier, the Armenians are basically a tiny population. And out of that tiny population, how many were literate is difficult to say, but I would say until the 20th century, we're looking at very low levels of literacy. The main people who will take credit for increasing literacy among Armenians are the Bolsheviks. Because they simplified writing, they simplified the language itself, they made literacy more available for obviously their own purposes. But that's in the 1920s, 30s. But in this earlier period, we're talking about minuscule numbers of readers. Which side had more readers? I can't really say. It would depend, but those are good questions.
So there was more of a competition between the Catholics and the apostolics, despite the fact that there were very few who could read the materials that were being printed, or it was just
the church,
disseminated to
most of this material was being produced for the use by churchgoers and by the church on both sides.
But who were, I'm just thinking, who were those 60, who read those 60,000 books or just
Good question.
in Amsterdam?
Literacy is very low. We can't really answer who read those books. I mean, most of the books, majority of the books, I should say, and I didn't get to this at all in my talk. But if you look at the number of books that were printed, right? I mentioned 1,000 titles and about 500,000 books, 500,000 approximately. If you give a 500, if the print run is 500, which is pretty low, let's say it's 300 to 500, you have around 500,000 books in this entire 300-year period. So how many of these were read individually? Well, most of the books were read were produced for the church, for churchgoers, and for the pious readers. They're probably read by others, and other people literate. You don't. I mean, majority of the population was illiterate, but I think what happened probably is that there were enough literate people among them so that they could read to a larger audience, let's say 100 people or 50 people, and people could consume books through their ears and not just through their eyes. But those are good questions. Literacy levels are very low, very low.
The question would be how many functioning churches were there? Where would be a priest who would read that to the parishioners? So if we get that number,
Why would you need
multiply it
60,000
by
books for
or
that?
divide it by. So the,
Well, 60,000 books in
in 500
in a 50-60 year period.
Still.
Still.
One church, read it.
No, they're not one. There were approximately, I don't have, that's a good question. The number of churches there were, I think, anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 churches in across
it's very
Armenia.
possible. And if you say 500 books, there wasn't enough for every church. And I'm not sure there was a literate priest in every church.
No, well, but you needed just one semi-literate priest, right? The most famous case of print making an impact on an illiterate audience is a case involving an Armenian from Iran by the name of Joseph Emin, who was an Armenian from Hamadan. Originally went to school in Calcutta and then traveled to London in 1752. And Joseph Emin basically made his way into the Armenian into parts of Armenia in the 1760s, and there's an episode in his memoir, The Life and Adventures of Joseph Armenian Armenian, written in English by himself, where he rides on a horse into this small village by the name of Genis. In his book, the village is identified as Genis, but today that village is called Khanus. It's near Erzurum, I think, near Kari. So he enters this village on a horse, and the Armenian villagers are, at first, when they hear him speak in Turkish, they fall to the ground, start worshiping him, and so on. And then finally he says, "Get up! What are you doing? I'm Armenian. I'm one of you." And then they're about to beat the living daylights out of him because he's riding a horse. And at some point he says, "What is it about you that you're behaving in such a slavish manner?" And they say, "Well, because our priests have told us that our nation was born to be subjugated to the Ottomans, to the Turks, from time immemorial." And Emin says, "What kind of a strange history is this? Where did you learn this?" And then at one point, he describes this very graphically. He goes like this, he opens his very large coat, and from his pocket, he flips out a paperback portable edition of Moses Khorenatsi, the first history of Armenia, written in the 7th or 5th centuries, depending on which school it belonged to. So he flips it out of his pocket. It's a small pocket-sized edition. We own a copy of it in our library, and until I saw it with my own eyes, I hadn't realized why size was important. Size is important. Portable copies are important because this is an age in the early modern period where people are traveling across great distances. And Emin provides us with one smoking gun example of how, even in an illiterate place, Khanus, in the eastern remote regions of the Ottoman Empire, all he needs is one portable book, pocket-sized edition of Emin, and all he needs in addition to that is one person. The whole village is illiterate, right? So he says, "Is there anybody here who can read?" Of course, say, "Yes, our priest." So the same priest who had told him the stories, he calls the priest and he gives the book. He gives the priest Emin's Moses Khorenatsi's book and says, "Read from this chapter. It's on the Arsacid dynasty of Armenia, ruling Armenia in the 1st century AD CE." And so the priest reads it, and the people are dumbfounded by this. And they say, "Wow, we have never been taught like this before," and so forth. And then the priest then goes off on some long digression about Emin being a messiah who's been sent. He's been prophesied by Nerses the Great from the 4th century, and he has finally showed up to rescue them. But in any case, the point here is that portability of the book, the Khorenatsi book, and the fact that it was printed in Amsterdam, 1695, the first book printed in Amsterdam, Thomas van Andetzi, was this Moses Khorenatsi history. Portability makes a difference.
Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Well, just going off the previous questions, I was curious, do we have much evidence regarding the Armenian diaspora, i.e. printers in cities like Calcutta or Madras, with regard to the issue of like vernacular printing either in languages other than Armenian or perhaps printing in the Armenian script, but different vernacular tongues, because this was also a common practice in different parts when print like arrived in other parts of, say, the Islamic world, for instance. Use of like things like Judeo-Persian or
of course, yeah.
And what can your research highlight about that vernacular printing?
Well, I can tell you there's a lot on vernacular printing in my book, but almost none of it deals with India. And the reason is because vernacular printing, two things about vernacular printing for the Armenians, vernacular in general. Yeah. When we say vernacular in most Armenian contexts, you think of Western Armenian or Eastern Armenian as vernacular languages. They were created in the 19th century, 20th century. 19th, 20th centuries, after a long 100-year struggle between vernacular and classical. But in this earlier period, you do have a vernacular that's not Western Armenian. It's called Armeno-Turkish. It's basically Anatolian Turkish. Low-level, low-register Turkish, understood and spoken by most people in the Ottoman Empire. The Armenians wrote in that language, but they wrote it in the Armenian script. And a good chunk of the books that were published in this period were actually in Armeno-Turkish. So I didn't show you the graphics, but Daniel, I should have said, is my graduate student, did incredible work for me in terms of crunching out these statistical data tables and so forth. And we were also able together to figure out the number of what percentage of the books were in what languages, right? Armenians, of course, read. To the extent that they read in different languages. So the dominant language is classical Armenian, which is like what Latin is to Italian. The Armenians had classical Armenian, which is grappa, and that made up approximately, if I remember correctly, over 95% of all the books printed were in classical Armenian. Certainly over 90%, certainly. The next major language group, if you want to call it a language group, the next major literary form, let's say literary language, was Armeno-Turkish, 4%. And then there was vernacular Armenian mixed with Armeno-Turkish. There's vernacular Armenian. Some of it was beginning to emerge in this earlier period, but very, very minuscule. Less than 1% is probably a language that we would today identify as vernacular. We call it, in Armenian, it's called Calcutta Hayeren, which is civil Armenian, Armenian spoken and read and written in cities by merchants. And so there is this vernacular as well, but this is also a tiny element. The vast amount, overwhelming number of the books that were published were in classical Armenian, the language of the church. Tanya?
So as an organizer, I keep the last question for myself. So I'm a scholar working on nationalism. And your last sentence in your presentation was, without understanding confessionalism, we cannot understand Armenian nationalism.
Yeah.
So can you, maybe in a very short sentences,
okay.
What is the relation between both of them?
Relationship between them is that basically, okay, so confession is different from from religion, right? Religion is a larger category. Confession is a smaller subcategory of religion. And within Christianity itself, in the early modern period, because of the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, what you had was the drawing of the boundaries between confessions. In this case, it started with the Roman Church, and then different forms of Protestantism arose in the Reformation in Europe. You had Lutheranism, different varieties of Protestant confessions. So each confession has its own confession that people had to recite in order to prove their membership to a group. And so in this period that I'm talking about in my book, all the emphasis was on defining and strictly making impenetrable the boundaries between confessions. So Armenians and Catholics were basically, I mean, they're very different, obviously, but they were not as different as they came to be in the 18th century because of this conflict. Initially, the boundaries were porous. People could be both Catholics and members of the Armenian Church. Nobody was, the boundaries were not drawn as distinctly. But in this period of conflict, they were. And my basic argument about nationalism and so on is that if you look at the conventional scholars of Armenian nationalism, whether it's my friends Ron Suni or Razmik Panosyan and others, you will see that they begin their analysis by arguing that Armenians were, before the 19th century, Armenians were an ethno-religious community. Somehow in the 19th century, they magically became transformed into a secular national community from an ethno-religious one. And so my argument is, no, you have the wrong category, my friends. You have to have the category of confession, not religion. Because the main form of alterity for the Armenians in this period, why they were printing so many books, were not, let's say, Muslims. They were not Muslims or Buddhists or, I don't know, some other religion. Their main concern for the Armenians, the main concern of the Armenian Church was other types of Christians who were Armenians. In this case, Catholic Armenians. And so they were the main, they bore the brunt of the attacks, and particularly the Catholic Armenians from Venice, known as the Makhitarist order. They were the main target for the Armenian Church, and the Armenian Church is competing to outdo them in print, right? Venice, European city, as the Catholicos of the Armenians in the 1780s said, oh, they can talk whatever they want. They live in a comfortable place. They don't have to worry about their lives on a daily basis. But there they produce some of the best books in the world in Venice. Small community. How many Armenians in Venice? Any takers?
34.
Not 5,000. You would think 5,000, right? I thought 5,000 when I first started falling in love with the Venetian aspect of this history. There were 80 Armenians in Venice, not more, at one time. And they outcompeted Istanbul for the number of books. Like neck to neck, Venice and Istanbul, Venice and the Ottoman Empire. On the one hand, in Istanbul, you had 80,000 Armenians, the largest urban collection of Armenians in the world, versus 80 in Venice. And yet, the Venetian Catholics, the Mukhtaris, were producing better and higher quality and more number of books than the Armenians were. And so their main concern was the Armenian church was really focused on Catholics. Catholics were the other against which they defined themselves. And of course, the transformation from ethno-confessional to secular nationalism occurred in the 19th century after the Tanzimat reforms in the 1860s, 1870s. Up until 1870s, if you were a Catholic Armenian, you were not considered Armenian. So you could be anything, you couldn't be Armenian. To be an Armenian until the 1870s meant being a member of the Armenian church with its hierarchy in the Echmiadzin. If you didn't recognize the Catholicos, you're not an Armenian.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sebouh. And the floor is yours.
Yes, I can just conclude. Thank you so much, Sebouh, for a fascinating talk. We have so many additional questions we can ask you afterwards.
Sure.
Anyone on Zoom who wishes to ask questions, please feel free to send them by email. I'm sure Professor Aslanian would be happy to answer them. So we will close this event. Believe it or not, we actually have one more event associated with the Promise Armenian Institute this quarter, fall quarter. And I am happy to announce that on Saturday, December 9 at 2 p.m. Pacific, here on the UCLA campus at the James Bridges Theater in Melnitz Hall, the Nadakatsi Chair in Armenian Studies, Professor Peter Cowie, is hosting a screening of the film It Takes a Village, which is the winner of the Best International Short Film at the 2023 Oscar qualifying LA Shorts Film Festival. This film was directed by Ophelia Harutyunyan and portrays the story of a group of women living in an Armenian village where there are no men, as they have all left for Russia for work. So at the conclusion of the film, there will be a discussion with Yvette Amirian, an adjunct faculty member at USC, and moderated by a film scholar here on our UCLA campus, Arev Shatian of the School of Theater, Film, and Television. So this is a free event, and keep your eyes open for advertising on our Promise Armenian Institute website and social media. So once again, thank you all for your attendance. Thank you to Professor Sebouh Aslanian for a fascinating talk. Thank you to Hasmik Bagdasarian and others who have been working so diligently behind the scenes. Thank you.